What's up, students? Mr. McDonald here with another edition of Unit 7 on the church or on ministry. I wanted to do a video for you guys on the church history so you guys could kind of know where we stand as a church, and you can kind of see how things happen throughout history. But I want to preface it with this. This is very minimal information. I'm just giving you guys the major events and things. But if you wanted to study this seriously, you would probably have to get a master's degree. And so that's like 6 or 7 years of studying it to really fully understand what's happened in the last 2,000 years with the church. It's very big, and it's a lot of information in there. So with that being said, get ready to take some notes. And I just want you guys to kind of get an idea of all the changes and things that took place over time. So this is the second lesson in the unit on ministry, so you guys can understand what Christians have historically done. So first thing, just a couple things to understand. First is this. Before Christianity was born in what's called antiquity. That means there wasn't a lot of history or historians or people who knew how to explain what was going on to future generations. That's why we have archaeology and things like that, so we can kind of figure out what the past was like. And before Christianity, our written history only goes back, like our study of history only goes back about another 2,000 years, if that. After that, it's mostly conjecture and us just trying to figure stuff out. And some people, I believe, are right or wrong in how they study that. So the whole world is not that old. The history of the church covers about, half of history. So it's big. But some important things to understand. First off, when you guys look at the church in history, it might seem strange because of how different it was. And it's not like our current church. But it's important to note, it's different because the whole world was different. Everything was different. The way people thought was different. They didn't know probably 1% of what you already know, what you were given from people who pass it down to you, because we read and write. We have access to books, and you basically have access to all of human information that's ever existed with this. There's also a lot of fake information too on there too, so you have to be able to figure out what's real and what's not. But it's not the past that's weird, it's actually us that's weird. We live in our contemporary world, particularly in the United States, in what's called an anomaly. This is something that's very, very, very rare. It is, I'm at the coffee shop here, so it's my normal spot. So no one's in here except for a few people buying food. It just opened back up, so I figured why not do it indoors. So if you hear weird music in the background, that's it. Hopefully I don't bother anybody. There's really no one else here. So anyways, it's this country and this time in the world that's very strange. We don't have people invading us and coming and burning our homes and stealing our children and things like that. That's pretty rare for history. So we live in a time of relative peace and a very safe, wealthy, definitely the most wealthy and the most educated people and time in history. So we're very, very privileged. So when you look back, don't think of that as strange. Think of us as strange. This is really rare as far as the whole history of the world. So just keep that in mind. We're in like an anomaly, what they call an anomaly right now. So the first period to know is called the Apostolic Age. This means the age of the apostles. And it kind of starts with the birth of Christ. In this age, you have the first or the last Old Testament prophet, who's John the Baptist. Remember, Jesus says that the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist, because he was considered like Old Testament. And he died, he was killed. And the apostles are kind of the people who witnessed, capital A. Remember how we learned capital A, apostle? These are the people who witnessed Jesus in his resurrected form. And he taught them and sent them out. They had great authority in the church. John, James, a brother of Jesus, Peter, Paul, guys like that. And so the church had people to look up to that could guide them if they went off. As you guys know, a lot of the books in the Bible were corrections, for when the churches were deviating or there was false teachers in there. So in this period, the New Testament was written. And we kind of have the history and the teachings in this period because that's what the Bible is, the New Testament. So we have pretty good documentation of what took place and how people thought and what they did. Um, in this period, the church grew in a very miraculous and kind of grassroots way, mostly in the area immediate to Rome, but also beyond. I mean, there's people that went as far as India, they say, in different parts of the world, there's different, kingdoms that, we don't typically study in this setting. But also, it's important to note this was a heavy time of persecution. You had the Emperor Nero during this time. The Romans sometimes just took it out on Christians. And so there was this time of intense persecution, not just from the Romans, but also the Judaizers and the Jews attacked the Christians because Christianity was from Judaism. It was sort of a type of Judaism if you ask people at the time. And they were heavily attacked and heavily persecuted during this time. Fed to lions. I'm sure you guys have heard read about this in Fox's Book of Martyrs. It was a rough time for the church, but the church also grew miraculously. So that's the apostolic age. If there was ever a serious debate about something, you'd ask an apostle. They'd send you a letter. This is kind of a classic painting of Jesus handing the keys of the kingdom over to Peter. Here's all the Anglican-looking disciples, because this is painted in England, so they all look like white English dudes. Interesting garb. And this kind of building in the background, I don't think it existed at the time, but these kind of look Roman with the arcs and stuff. Anyways, got some buildings there going on. Pretty cool. Interesting painting. The next period is what is called the Ante-Nicene period. Now, it doesn't mean anti like against. It means before. So as you guys probably have figured out, this is the period before the Council of Nicaea. That's why it's Ante-Nicene. If you guys ever go to like a really hardline Italian restaurant, they're going to have a section on the menu called antipasta, which is the things that you eat before you eat the pasta, before the main meal comes out. That's the appetizers. So this is an Ante-Nicene period. It's marked with also heavy persecution of the Christians by the Roman government and more. But this period is super important because big theological ideas are started here by various what they call ante-Nicene fathers or big Christian theologians who wrote them down. So, and some of these were like guys were converted by John, by guys from the Bible. And we have their writings and we see their big theological ideas, which really laid the groundwork for the sections of Christianity that come up and beliefs and doctrines that became debated. And you'll see, if you guys get into the history, if you ever studied on your own, how this person's writing led to this kind of way of viewing doctrine, and things like that. So it's really interesting. I underlined in here one of the theological fathers named Tertullian because he didn't write in Greek. He wrote in Latin. And so what you're going to find as we go into the next periods is that the church kind of split between Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking. And this is sort of one of the deep down rooted origins was, the language that the people wrote in. Kind of helps separate these two groups, in time, sadly. So this is also a period where Christians fought off various heresies. You got Gnosticism, all sorts of different heresies, and they wrote books and letters fighting off the heresies. There's also a couple books and letters written to like Roman officials explaining the Christian faith and explaining to Romans, because Romans had a lot of weird beliefs about Christians, as we talked about earlier in the year. They believed that Christians would they're incestuous, that they would marry their siblings. They believed that the Christians would eat little babies because, as the Romans would, their form of abortion was throwing like an infant out on the street, letting it die. The Christians would pick it up and raise it. They thought that they were eating them. There's all sorts of weird things. So people would write to the Romans and say, look, stop persecuting us. This is what we believe. We're a moral people. So the church remained underground, but had to deal with how do we meet together, especially as they got big. So they met in homes, they met in public places, and they met in places like graveyards, which were public spaces where no one would really go and bother them. And so, You get a weird reputation if you do stuff like that. But that's what they had to do. So they're dealing with, how do we deal with this kind of growth? What does it look like? Over time, the church was established pretty well. And this period kind of ends at the Council of Nicaea at 325. Because what happened at the Council of Nicaea, as we know, is you had now a Roman emperor who's not persecuting the Christians, but became a Christian, supposedly, even though he wasn't baptized till much later. He became a Christian and was very much in support of the Christians, even though he was still an emperor and had to wage war and stuff like that. And that was a big difference, how do you mix Christianity and war? So anyways, when this happened, that really kind of changed everything about Christianity, as we're going to see next. So here's another depiction of kind of the ante-Nicene fathers are all together. They all, this is way later, but so they're depicted, as all organized, and they got a church or whatever this is. But you kind of see that they got Pope hats. I never got a hat. I don't know. The next age is kind of the Middle Ages in a sense. There was, after the Council of Nicaea, there's the Middle Ages kind of more like 500. I just included, after the Council of Nicaea because I didn't want to split it into too many chunks for us. But in this period, Christianity and Rome kind of come together, and persecution in the way that it was before stops. Now, there's still persecution, but it's persecution of certain people or groups and ideas when like a pope or an emperor, get power, they kind of persecute the opposing believers. So it's really kind of, this is an interesting period. You also see over time, the church really starts drifting away from what Scripture teaches and starts drifting away from the organization that the apostles had and from the church that you read about in the Bible. And officially, Christianity becomes a state religion of Rome in 380. Some Christians did not like this mingling of the Roman Empire with Christianity. And you can see why, because, now bishops, instead of being persecuted, people are bringing them money. They're very famous and popular, and so they become very wealthy, and they start passing down that wealth to their kids and making them bishops. And, you can see how, with power, corruption kind of comes in. Well, it came in pretty heavy during this time, especially as it progressed. And as you read and you see, the church slowly deviates from the Bible, and everything from the worship of Mary to the idea that you have to do works to be saved, to the idea that you could pay indulgences to do certain sins or be forgiven from certain sins. I mean, it gets crazy. But anyways, when the church in Rome kind of started commingling, a lot of Christians thought that this was kind of not great. So this led to what was called the monastic movement. Basically, some people just went away and decided that to live holy, they had to get out of the empire. And so they would go out in the woods or in caves, and then people would find them and learn from them and bring them food. And so eventually they founded what are monasteries. They were monks, so they founded monasteries. And then these became organized. And they started having rules and things like this. So you have people who would leave their life to go become monks. And these monks were very sought after, and they were considered super Christians, So they would chime in on big events or big doctrinal issues every once in a while. They didn't like doing that, but people would kind of go to them for really grassroots wisdom. So these guys are actually pretty hardcore, right? So that's the monastic movement started at this point. So ideas about the Roman Pope, theological ideas about creeds and fights between the words and particular creeds and cultural and lingual differences began to separate the church into two main branches. And these branches became what were called the Eastern Branch, which is Byzantine, or the Byzantine Empire, or Greek Orthodox, or just Orthodox. And these people all spoke Greek, which is the original language, I guess you could say, of Christianity. That's what the Bible was written in. And then the Western part, which is called the Roman Catholic Church, which spoke Latin. Now remember, Tertullian wrote in Latin, so a lot of his ideas go there. So you see the schism starting right here. And then there was an official break in 1054 called the Great Schism. And this Great Schism was where, Byzantine Empire and the Roman Catholic Empire separated. They both had their popes were excommunicating each other. There was this big drama. So you ended up having the church which was also the empire, kind of splitting in two. And so now you had like two competing sort of empires of Christianity now. I mean, how did you go from like meeting in homes to like now you have two empires of Christianity? So the Western one, as you guys can see, was over here in Western Europe, where a lot of um, America has descendants originally from these areas. There's Italy right here, and France, and England up there. Then you have this other part is what modern day like Turkey and Greece and these areas over here on the east side. And then you got Russia way up there. That matters later because there's an Orthodox Church in Russia that's pretty big. So that's the end of the Middle Ages, and you come into the Renaissance age. 1054 is when the Great Schism happened. This period, the church was really neck deep in heresy, and there's a lot of nasty stuff that took place. Everybody was illiterate. I mean, the feudal system was going on, and there's a lot of wars, and the empires were falling apart. It was crazy time. Not a great time to be a person who wants to be a faithful Christian. The church had way too much power. People weren't allowed to read the Bible. I mean, it was nuts. But there were a lot of faithful people who wanted to just to be, people of faith during this time, even though the church was vastly corrupt. So part of the problem was, evil people infiltrating the church because that's where the power was. Evil people want to go where the power is at. But mainly it was just bad doctrine, which deviated greatly from Scripture. And the church structure was focused around power and wealth. And that's incongruent with the Bible, generally speaking. Like Christians can have power and wealth, but we're not to seek that. It's not like our goal in a sense, as a church, anyways. So, our main mission is to reach the world with the gospel, not to become rich. Anyways, the church was just so corrupt. You get all sorts of various things happening. The Crusades happened about this time, which was really a response to Islam, because Islam was invading all of the Christian territories and doing some pretty nasty stuff. So Christians got all juiced up and got their young men and sent them all to combat, the Islam. And so it's real funky stuff. Also, the Inquisitions, where the church hierarchy would find people who had deviating beliefs and like torture and execute them and persecute them. Not fun times. So eventually the Eastern Orthodox portion of the faith, at least the empire of it, fell to the invading Muslim empire called the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans came in and they basically took over it. They allowed the church to exist and even kind of elect leaders and things like that. But they were heavily persecuted in different times. And they were kind of second-class citizens anyway, if you understand Islam, the way they work. If you're not a Muslim, when they take over an area, they don't force you to be a Muslim, but you do have to be a second-class citizen. And eventually, these things resulted in massive persecutions called genocides, where the Islamic population tried to kill everybody, Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. Pretty rough. And this led to a lot of migration. So you have a lot of Armenians all over the place that left Armenia during this time of genocide. So there was a lot of people who wanted to reform the Western Church. The Eastern Church Empire got obliterated. The Western Church was slowly falling apart, the fall of Rome, quote unquote. But it's mainly massive corruption that when people became bishops and they started reading the Bible, they would look at it and say, what is this? None of this stuff is in the original faith. It's not historical. It was all added in over time. One of the most important of these guys was a guy named Wycliffe from England, who argued that the Bible should be given to the common people in their own language, and that all people just need a personal relationship with God, and the papacy is not biblical. And these are all things that Protestants believe now, but back then you did not say stuff like that. So this guy got persecuted. He actually translated the Bible into English and into what was then Middle English. So remember, this is still 100 years or so, maybe more, probably 200 years, before the King James Bible. So English didn't sound like it does now. You couldn't even understand it if they read to you this Bible. But the point is, he translated into the vernacular of the common people and just gave it to the bishops and the people who couldn't read Scripture, because mainly Scripture was read in Latin. So unless you knew Latin, which most people didn't. So here's a picture of Wycliffe giving his Bible out to all the poor monks so they could read the Bible. So that all led up to what was called the Reformation, commonly called the Reformation. So that was this period is called the Reformation. So it's 1517 to what I would consider probably 1730. So this is where Martin Luther, who was a Catholic, he published something called the 95 Theses, which is basically just a giant essay or main points that call for the Roman Catholic Church to repent from its evil deeds and false doctrines. And so he just reads the Bible. He's a very sincere dude. And he says, look, these things are wrong. You can't do this. This is incongruent with the faith. If you've ever read the Bible, you'll see that. And so he wanted to reform the church. There's a lot of people in this movement, but he is kind of the main focus dude. There's also John Calvin, all sorts of guys. But this reform effort ultimately failed. In other words, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, did not go through the reform. They actually kind of doubled down and said, no, this is what we believe now, and this is what we're doing. So instead of reforming the church, it kind of gave rise to a different group of organizational churches called Protestants. Although they didn't like that word, they like to call themselves reformers or evangelicals. And that kind of set off a firestorm of rebellion against the church, which was this church was used to having a lot of power. And so that caused drama, as you guys can imagine. So this is now another time of persecution in the church, started from the Roman Catholic denomination. One of the famous groups of this time to kind of like spread and separate from everybody was called the Puritans, who left the old world for the new world. So this is a time of colonization, and North America was being colonized. South America was being colonized by like the Portuguese and the Spanish. North America was being colonized by the French and the English. And these were English-speaking people, and they came to North America to establish like a utopia, like a perfect place where they weren't going to be persecuted by the Catholics, and they weren't going to be influenced by all the like nasty cultures around them. They could live in an organized way as a religious community. It was a pretty hardcore struggle, if you guys ever read. It wasn't easy when they got here. But this period ends with what I call what everyone calls the First Great Awakening, which was after colonization had already established huge, colonies, and people were kind of deviating away from the original idea. You had the First Great Awakening, which was a massive religious revival. So the picture I have for you guys at the end of this is sort of these three women, sisters, who were murdered and burned alive because they were Protestants. It's kind of stuff that would go on. One of the babies was burned in 1566, not that long ago. So some great literature at this time and poetry at this time. But if you're a Christian, another hard time to be alive, particularly if you're a Protestant of any type. So you could be killed and persecuted, or among other things. So sad. You can look that up if you want. Then you have kind of just before where we are now, and this is where we're going to end, really. It's just modern Christianity. This is basically from the time of the First Great Awakening to World War II. And you have a massive growth in Protestantism and various movements that took shape and created various denominations, which all have their own values and specific doctrines that they go with. But over time, these groups have sort of gone away from this idea that the church is one giant organization headed by one guy, to the idea that the church is more spiritual than it is physical. So, it's sort of overseen by Jesus, which is what I believe, and all Protestants believe, and that basically you have fellowship with people from different groups that are the church, the universal church. But it's not because they have they're part of a particular denomination, but it's because they believe in certain important doctrines that make us all in the same faith, even though we're of a different denomination. And those doctrines are things like the Trinity, the gospel, in the sense that you're saved not by your works but through faith, the authority of the Bible, etc. And if you kind of accept these things, you're included in the great church. So me as a Protestant, I could go and hang out with a Baptist, with a Pentecostal guy, with a Methodist, with a Church of Christ dude, um, a Vineyard. And I consider all them Christians, just like I'm a Christian, even though they're not part of my denomination. That's kind of a new idea because the world has changed. And so it seems normal to us, but for 2,000 years, that wasn't the case. If you started your own group with various beliefs, you're a heretic, and that was that. So it's a different time, for sure. So the Roman Catholic Church actually still exists today. They have a pope. They have land still called the Vatican. It's not as much land as the Roman Empire used to have, but they still exist. And they still have a pope, and they actually have undergone numerous positive reforms. So you don't see the type of corruption you saw, 500 years ago. There obviously is still corruption going on in these churches you guys see in the contemporary headlines, but there's corruption everywhere, right? Eastern Orthodox Church still exists. They don't really have a pope. They have what's called an ecumenical patriarch who kind of works like a pope, but they still exist. They still exist all over the place. Greece, obviously. There's a lot of them in Ethiopia, and there's a lot in Russia. So you have in the United States. I have a couple of Greek Orthodox friends, and of course, Protestant churches have thrived, and they've been boosted by these things called Great Awakenings. So there's been several Great Awakenings which were headed by preachers who taught kind of working class people around the English speaking world. They would kind of do circuits and preach outside, and created just these huge religious revivals that have kind of kept the church from going into secularism, in a sense. Like, it's kept people with authentic, real Christian faith instead of absorbing the kind of secular humanist ideas that pop up, about the world. And so it's been, definitely interesting. So that's actually modern Christianity, because I ended that at 1945, at the end of World War II. Since then, we would have what I would argue is contemporary Christianity, and that would be like a whole nother slideshow. I don't want to get into that, but it's what we have now, and we could probably talk about that later if you guys want to talk about it later, but I'm not going to include that in this teaching. So there you have it. There you guys have a very, very brief overview of some of the most important things that have happened in Christianity on earth since the time of Jesus and how it's changed. So make sure that you guys know these terms. Make sure you guys know what is the apostolic age, which is the age of the apostles. You don't need to know that. Make sure you guys know what ante-Nicene means, which means just before the Council of Nicaea. You don't got to memorize the names. You guys already know the Council of Nicaea. You guys should understand that Christianity became the state religion of Rome. You guys should know where monasteries came from monks who kind of left during that time. You should know what the Great Divide is. Orthodox versus the Catholic Church separating, and you should know the date for that too, 1054. And you guys need to know what the Reformation is. You need to know who Martin Luther is. You need to know what the 95 Thesis is. Maybe I'll have you guys read it for a homework assignment. That'll be fun. And you guys should know what a Protestant is, even though no one really likes that term. You should probably know who the Puritans are. That's actual easy history. First Great Awakening. That should be it. Know the three sections of Christianity, current main sections: Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant. All right, friends, that's it. Hope everyone's doing well. You guys have, for 11th graders, you have this week, you have next week, and then you're just going to have a test on this unit on the third week, and you guys are going to be done. So the finish line is there. Make sure you're getting all your work done on time. All right, guys. I love you, and I will see you soon.